Thank you, Mr. Vohra. Thank you so much. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you, pleasure to be talking about the National Education Policy 2020. I had the privilege of being a part of the drafting committee, which was the Dr. Kasturirangan committee. So much of what I share with you today is on the basis of that experience, and in the way that I have seen that the draft policy, which itself was 484 pages, has in essence been summarized into the 66-page policy, which has been approved by the Union Cabinet. Now, what I will do is my remarks will be in three parts. The first part is a bit of a story. It's a story that brings to life some matters of the policy. The second part is about the choices on the basis of which the policy has been made, or the choices that the policy has made. And we all know policies are about choices, and therefore this is perhaps the most important of all things to consider when we think of the fundamentals. Third, I'll share a few brief remarks about the implementation, its possible challenges. Much of it is well known. So let me start with the brief story that I was talking about. I'm speaking to you from Bhopal today. Day before yesterday, I was in a place which is between the two towns of Sagar and Rehli, somewhere in central Madhya Pradesh. It was the afternoon. It was a small village off the highway. I had gone there because there's a government primary school teacher who goes every day to the village in these days when the schools are not open. And what he's done is that he's mobilized 4 volunteers in the village. His school where he serves has about 40 students, grade 1 to 5. He arranges those 40-odd students in 4 different places. One is in the village temple, the other is on one courtyard which has a sort of a shade, and 2 other places. And with the help of those 4 volunteers, who are basically, class 10 and class 12 girls, she's been teaching those kids. The day that I went there, it was raining. It's unusual for that part of Madhya Pradesh to be raining so heavily as it was, but he was there nevertheless. It is quite remarkable. And his essential explanation was, well, how can I let this happen? The pandemic has stopped schools for such a long time. What will happen to my kids? Now, this man, once he finished that, he was talking with me. And I was surprised, but it's not as though I've been not surprised before, similarly. He said, Saab, जो नई शिक्षा नीति आई है, the new national education policy, बहुत अच्छी है. I said, अच्छा? I asked him why. Why are you saying that the national education policy is good? And he had absolute specifics. So let me point out the 3 specifics that he said. 1, he said, sir, मेरी तो उम्र हो गई, मैं तो retire होने वाला हूं. I'm near retirement. But this policy, what it does is that it equates the service conditions and the compensation, the scales of the primary school teacher to that of the secondary and the higher secondary school teacher. It's saying, well, the role of a primary school teacher is as challenging, as complex, as important that as of a higher secondary or a secondary school teacher. So why should they be paid any less? And it's that service condition issue which forces teachers like me, I'm paraphrasing him, to look for, in quotes, promotion. And the primary system keeps losing good teachers. So this policy is remarkable that it's equating and giving equal importance to these 2 teachers' categories. which it must be. Second, he said, ये बहुत अच्छा कर रहे हैं, ये B.Ed की दुकानें जो चलाई जा रही हैं उसको बंद करने वाले हैं. This is well known to all of us. The B.Ed system is dysfunctional, it's corrupt, and the policy is taking it head on. That's what he was saying. And third, he says, look, the policy says something very simple and basic, which is that how can we expect our teachers to have perhaps the kind of position that Mr. Vohra was talking about if we are not willing to give them the very basics of life? If where they are working, they don't have a toilet. If the textbooks that they are supposed to be working with, they arrive 6 months after the session starts. So the policy commits to making sure that the basic conditions for the teacher are fulfilled and met. And so he said, this policy is remarkable. I came back actually to Sagar, which is the closest town, which is where I'm staying. And I was reflecting about it. And I must say that while this is the first instance of such a conversation that I've had with school teachers after the policy was approved by the Union Cabinet, I've had similar conversations many a times after the draft national education policy was set out for public comment. Now, I'm going to move on to the second part of my remarks. The reason he's able to say all this, the reason he feels all this, is because of the choices the policy is based on, the choices that the policy has made. So the second part of what I'm sharing is about the choices. And once we talk about choices, we have to remember that the choices that were made, other choices could have been made. Also, the choices are not made in vacuum. They're, of course, made in the context of the history of our education system. But even more so, they are made in the context of the current social political environment. Okay. So these choices that have been made, the choices that have been made are absolutely related to the current environment, and they could have therefore been something else altogether. So what are these choices that I'm talking about, which I'm giving so much importance to, right? I must mention that I think these are the good and the right choices. I can't take all of them, but I'll take a few. And what I'll do is when I talk about a choice, I will actually illustrate it with some concrete example from within the policy. Let's take the first one. Given where we stand today, not today or the past 10, 15, 20 years, the policy could have made a choice of a very instrumental, narrow view of education, that the only purpose of education is to create people for employment or develop people for employment or employability. It has not done that. It has taken a much broader view of what education is, which is the view we have taken from 1966. But it has endorsed that view of education as a fundamental process for social human development, as a fundamental democratic process, and that makes all the difference subsequently to the policy. Now, when I say that that's the choice it has made, where does one see it actually? As I said, where does it really take shape in the policy? Of course, it's reaffirmed in the statements about the purpose of education. But even more than that, as you will go through the policy, you'll see that it commits explicitly, not once, but in all relevant places, to the kind of values and dispositions, education should develop. And those values and dispositions, the capacities that it extols, scientific temper, critical thinking, these are the kind of things that would not have been there had it taken a very narrow instrumental view of education. We would have just talked about skilling and developing people for the job market. The second place where it very strongly, very explicitly expresses this choice is this strong commitment to liberal education. Very strong commitment to liberal education, and it is much talked about in the media. And this strong commitment to liberal education is not only at the level of undergraduate education, but the notion of how grades 9, 10, 11, 12 are to be restructured is also based on the essence of liberal education. Third, and this is to my mind very important, the choice of these broader purposes of education vis-a-vis the narrow purposes of education. It reflects in the emphasis the policy gives on the importance of cultural consonance within the system. What is it saying essentially? It's essentially saying that if that is the purpose of education, if that's what we want, if we want our children to develop the capacity to think for themselves, it's not just in the classroom that this happens. It's the culture of the institution, the school, the college, the education system. We know that impacts it. And therefore, it tries to sew together a fine tapestry of a culture which will support this kind of education. I'll give you a few specifics. Mr. Vohra was actually referring to something there, which is it explicitly commits very strongly autonomy of institutions, autonomy of schools and autonomy of higher education institutions. It commits to a structure which is board governed, which is much like what we have in the IIMs. And it commits, therefore, through that structure to eliminate, perhaps at a later date, but reduce certainly, any kind of external interference. It empowers the teacher and the institutions. It actually changes the regulatory environment. And all that why? Because unless you have cultural consonance with those purposes of education, it's very unlikely those wonderful statements that we make are actually ever going to become real. So choosing, not instrumental, but choosing the broader aims of education is a central theme, a central principle of this policy. Second, again, given the times we live in, given what we have seen over the past 10, 15, 20 years, it could have taken a very technocratic view of education. Very, very technocratic view of education. It does not. It explicitly, and its detail recognizes, is informed by that education is a social human endeavor. You cannot have a technocratic lens. Is management important? For sure. Is technology important? For sure. But that's just additions. The base is on the base of a social human endeavor. Now, as I mentioned, let me take a few examples. Where do you see this? You see this in the policy across. I'll give you a few instances. The centrality of the teacher. It gives teacher, in some senses, a central place. And it's not merely a matter of compensation. It's so many other things. It's about the stuff that teacher in that village in Sagar talked about, or near Sagar talked about. It's about basic respect. It's about empowering them at a date to actually develop their curriculum. So the centrality of the teacher is one thing where you can see this emphasis on education being a social human endeavor and not something technocratic. Second, I'm using an illustration. There are many such things. Second, it doesn't fall prey to these simplistic notions of accountability that have corroded education system after education system. It doesn't say that, look, let's look at the scores of the students and on that basis decide whether a teacher is good or not. Let's not shut down or invest into schools on the basis of just bare results of students. We're familiar that that kind of simplistic accountability systems have corroded education system after education system, corroded institution after institution, right? And it takes this nuanced view of what education is, and therefore doesn't fall into the trap of such simplistic accountability systems. Third, it's quite clear that the policy recognizes that equity leads quality. Quality does not lead equity. And that's again arising from this commitment of what its understanding of education is. Where do you see this? Where do you see this in the policy, that equity leads quality? I'll give you a range of instances. It's dramatic. If there is a centerpiece commitment in the policy, the centerpiece commitment in the policy is to early childhood education. And the centerpiece commitment is about equity. Because the truth of the situation today is that it's the privileged who go to early childhood institutions, and those who cannot do not have the benefit of that care, that education. So its centerpiece commitment is a big push on equity. Second, and I'll take an instance which is at the other extreme. Why does it envision the National Research Foundation? It envisions the National Research Foundation to foster, catalyze a culture of research in the country, not focused on our premier institutions. It's focused on the state universities, the colleges. That's what it's focused on. And that, to my mind, is an aspect of equity which we don't necessarily look at. I'll take a third instance, and this is a very interesting instance of detail. It explicitly mentions that the teacher-pupil ratio in schools that serve disadvantaged students can actually be much better. You may have a 30:1 teacher-student ratio in schools that serve relatively well-off students, but students that come from disadvantaged families, they need a lot more attention. And therefore, we should consider a much better teacher-pupil ratio. Right. Lastly, on the matter of choices, and I'll keep this very brief, it has made the choice, the policy has made the choice to confront some of the most contentious, some of the most problematic, some of the most entrenched, and some of the most difficult issues head on. It's confronting those issues head on. It could have made the choice to leave them on the side, skirt away. I'll take a few instances. First, it makes an explicit confession, an explicit acknowledgement that we are facing a crisis in our early school years, that of learning, of language, of arithmetic, of mathematics. And therefore, it talks about a range of measures to address this rapidly over the next 5 years. Confronting that issue, stating it so explicitly, is, I think, what is really critical. The choice could have been to underplay it. The choice could have been to even not even acknowledge it. And this full frontal acceptance is, to my mind, a very important choice that's been made. Second, and again, I'll go back to the teacher near Sagar, it confronts the issue head on that our B.Ed system, our teacher education system, leave aside a few good institutions, maybe a few hundred good institutions, but otherwise is dysfunctional. It needs to be rebuilt. And it's not just the institutional structure, it's our imagination of what teacher education is. And as we are familiar, there are vested interests galore. What it means is that we have to shut down hundreds of B.Ed colleges, perhaps, and D.Ed colleges. Let's take another one where it confronts directly. Regulatory ineffectiveness. We have a regulatory environment, a regulatory set of institutions, a structure, which has neither been able to stop commercialization and trivialization of education. It's not done that. On the other hand, it's not in any way set any kind of standards. I mean, our higher education system is bearing the brunt of that kind of a regulatory institutional structure and culture. School education too, and it confronts that directly. Right. So with that, which is the choices that are made, which form the fundamentals of this policy, and that could have been very different about what is the purpose of education, how that informs the policy, about a technocratic versus a social human endeavor view of education. and about confronting head-on some of the most difficult issues. This is what forms the basis of the policy. I'll just briefly allude to the implementation aspect, and then I'll hand it back. We all know that the devil is in the detail, and the devil is not really in the detail of the policy. The devil is really in the detail of the implementation. We all know that. Policies have been made, policies have come and gone, and it's the implementation that makes it happen. I would think it's too early to comment on the implementation. We can have just some very brief, perhaps comments. One, that the policy has explicitly committed, and it's a reaffirmation of an old commitment of investing 6% of GDP into public education. And we have to see whether the trend line over the next 2-3 years really tracks to that increase. And that really is, in some senses, the litmus test. This year, we know what we are facing. It's an unprecedented time. So I won't pay too much attention to this year. But over the next 2 to 3 years, we have to watch, observe, how does public expenditure track? Does it go step by step by step? In the draft national education policy, we had recommended take 10 years to do it. Let's see how it goes. So I think, to my mind, that's really, I mean, you could look at all kinds of indicators, but perhaps that's one of the most important indicators. Second, there are many things about the implementation of this policy that do not require money or do not require significant financial outlay. And I think a big test of the implementation is whether they are being done quickly, both at the government of India and, of course, the states. The legislative action that can be taken. There is, as I mentioned, B.Ed colleges and other kind of institutions that are really not colleges or education institutions, but just shops. They can be shut. That doesn't require money, or then perhaps legal fees. And the restructuring of the government structures, particularly in school education, that the policy mentions, that can be taken. That does not require financial outlay. Right? So that's something else that we can look at. Third and last, and I think this, to my mind, is even more important than the money, even more important than the legislative action, is at the level of the detail of the implementation of where people are required. What kind of people are we choosing? And I'm not talking about when the Higher Education Commission of India comes into being, or the National Research Foundation comes into being. You know, those institutions are so much in the spotlight that an effort will be made to get very good people there. That's not where the crunch is. The crunch is really, what kind of people are we choosing to be heading colleges and universities in the states, in the small towns? That, to my mind, is going to be the crucial test in the early years of implementation. We don't know. Implementation, as Mr. Vohra mentioned, has been the bane of all policies. We'll see over the next couple of years. All I can say is that given the choices that the policy has made, and given the choices that the policy has made in the social political environment that we live in, I think it's worth giving it every shot. It's worth giving all our support, all our might to make it happen. And if we are quibbling about details, those details can be battled out actually out there in the field when we are implementing it. Let me end by saying that in 2015, when this policy making was initiated, flagged off, if in 2015 somebody had told me or somebody had shown me this policy, I would have welcomed it with 100 cheers. Now that it's 2020, and now we have this policy. I would actually welcome it with 1,000 cheers, because in my mind, it's absolutely important.
The next set of questions is to Professor Anurag Behar. The new policy, how much it would be effective in the globalized world? It lays a lot of emphasis on education in local language, whereas English is becoming an important mode of conversation in this world. The second question is, why the final document of NEP is so different from the draft submitted in 2019? And the third question, this third question has been asked by a very senior IAS officer, Mr. Dev Sahayam. He says that this policy is predatory policy with the center violating the constitution and federal structure of India. How can the center arbitrarily grab school education from the states and dictate terms? School education must return to the states list as it was before 1976. Professor Anurag Behar.
Thank you. So, how does this policy respond to the increased globalization, increased integration of the globe, and things?
Yes.
Well, and I think that question's focus was particularly on the matter of education, and that to English. So I think the policy just bases itself on the well understood, the well recorded, with overbearing evidence that children learn better in their own language. And therefore, the policy recommends that the medium of instruction should be their own language. Now, at the same time, it is equally emphatic that children learn multiple languages well and much better at a younger age. So the policy is, while focusing on the matter that let's make the mother tongue, the local language, the home language as the medium of instruction, but at the same time, through multiple measures, is encouraging the idea of multilingualism. And within that multilingualism, it's of course Indian languages, but certainly there is English. So I don't think the policy in any way is disbalancing the fundamental educational issue that the mother tongue is a better medium of instruction versus perhaps these aspirations and the economic needs of learning other languages, including English. The second question was to do with why is the 66-page policy very different from the 484-page policy?
Yes.
Now, that's a question I will find it very hard to answer, because I was involved in writing the 484-page policy. I was not involved in cutting down the 484 pages into the 66 pages. But I can speculate. One part of the speculation is that it just in the sheer mechanics of summarizing 484 pages into 66 pages, a lot of it is lost. And what you lose, some of it might just be happenstance, some of it might be purposive, I don't know. So I think some of the differences are because of that. Some of the differences are because perhaps at the policy level, when the final policy was decided upon, the government of India did want to take a few different stances from what is there in the draft national education policy. But I must say that yes, there are differences. Yes, there are some noticeable differences, but it's not as dramatic as the questions seem to suggest. But let me remind you, I'm just speculating here because I was not involved in cutting down the 484 pages to 66 pages. The third is that, is the union government predatory? And is it taking over the states' rights and responsibilities of school education? Well, perhaps that Perhaps that trend goes back a long way if that's happening. However, I must say that if one reads the policy carefully, on the school education side, it is making suggestions. If you read the text, that's what it's doing. It is making suggestions. It is in no way suggesting that the government of India is actually deciding that that's exactly the way it will be. Now, when the Kothari Commission recommendations were implemented, the situation was pretty much the same. How are you going to have a nationally coherent set of principles, if not exactly the same system, at the same time leaving to the state, or why just the state, to the school, what is due to the state and the school? So we've been through this before. I don't read this policy as being particularly predatory on the rights of the states. Thank you.
The next question is to Professor Menon. The question asker is a very important person, Dr. Ramesh Deka, who was Director of All India Institute of Medical Sciences. His question is, how to internationalize higher education in India?
This is not about the policy, surely. I think if it's about the policy, one should ask the people who wrote the policy.
No, it's not relating to policy. It is a general question.
The global excellence and globally accepted standards and so on is often understood. And it's not just about this policy, but for several years, maybe for some 10, 15 years in India, this discourse of what is of international standards and global standards, world standards, all these used to be set. And I really feel that a globally excellent institution has to be, first of all, locally relevant. So only when it has an organic rooting on firm rooting on a particular stratum and is responding to that stratum in an organic manner, then can it rise itself to the level of a globally excellent institution. So international standards is largely in that sense. I wouldn't be really, think in terms of just collaborations and, faculty exchanges and twinning programs and stuff like that alone. That doesn't really create much of an international standards. Neither will inviting world players in foreign universities to come and set up shops here. Is not going to help. I think we need to really work in terms of creating excellent faculty. And if institutions have to be developed, there has to be good faculty. And we have to think of a serious program of creating excellence in our prospective faculty, attracting young, bright people to come into academia. A lot of attitudinal, the whole environmental ethos has to change for that. At the moment, it's a very unhappy situation. I hope it doesn't last for long. But at least in public universities, it's an environment of feeling oppressed and fearful. And I don't think those are the places where good research will happen. And those are the places where innovation of ideas will happen. All this will happen only if there is a certain liberality in the way in which universities, the ecosystem of universities is located. And only then will we rise to the international standards. It's not just a Lego toy approach of creating standard templates in various parts of the country and with linkages with institutions abroad, and suddenly it becomes international. I don't think it happens like that.
Kailash, you can proceed to. Are you going to deliver your vote of thanks?
Sir, now we come to the end of the program. On behalf of India International Center, I would like to profusely thank Professor Anurag Behar, Dr. Krishna Kumar, Professor Shyam Menon for sparing their time for this webinar. And as I had mentioned earlier, this webinar has really aroused a lot of interest, and the number of participants who have joined this webinar indicates that. And I'm sure today's deliberations are definitely going to be much more helpful in understanding this new policy. So with these words, I once again thank each one of you profusely on behalf of IAC, and I look forward for your more and more participation in IAC webinars and physical programs in future. And in the end, I also like to thank our President, Shri Vohra, who was kind enough to spare his time for chairing this entire session. Thank you very much, sir. And I thank everybody who has joined this webinar through the virtual mode. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.